There is a photograph taken in the early 1960s. Joan Bennett Kennedy stands beside Ted Kennedy at a formal event in Washington, one of those rooms designed to look effortless and important at the same time. The lighting is soft, the setting immaculate. She is dressed exactly as she is expected to be, elegant, composed, draped in pearls. He is confident, relaxed, entirely at ease in a world that seems built around him. At first glance, the image works perfectly. It tells a story that is easy to understand. A beautiful young couple, power, promise, proximity to something larger than themselves. It fits neatly into the mythology that would later define the Kennedy name: youth, glamour, inevitability. But if you look at it long enough, something begins to shift. It is not obvious. Nothing in the photograph breaks the surface. There is no gesture, no expression that openly contradicts what the image is trying to communicate. And yet, the longer you stay with it, the harder it becomes to ignore a small but persistent misalignment. Her smile never quite reaches her eyes. It is a detail that would be easy to dismiss if not for what comes after, because that photograph, like so many images that survive their moment, does not just capture what was visible. It captures something that had not yet been named. A tension, a distance. The beginning of something that would take years to fully emerge. Everyone knows the Kennedy story, or at least they know the version of it that has been told often enough to feel complete. The ambition, the victories, the tragedies that arrived in ways so public they seemed to belong to the entire country. It became more than a family. It became a narrative, a structure people could return to, examine, reinterpret. But within that structure, there are gaps. And inside those gaps, there are people whose lives were shaped by the same forces, but who were never fully included in the telling. Joan was one of them. She was always present, in the photographs, at the events, standing just slightly to the side, but never entirely outside the frame. She was part of the image, but not part of the story that image was meant to support. Her role was clear, even if it was never stated directly. She was there to complete the picture, not to define it. And for a long time, that was enough. Or at least it appeared to be. Because what photographs do particularly well is create the illusion of coherence. They take a single moment and give it a shape that feels stable, even when the reality surrounding it is anything but. They suggest that what is visible is also what is true. But lives do not unfold in still images. They unfold in accumulation, in what is said and what is not said, in what is acknowledged and what is quietly absorbed, in the distance between what a person is expected to be and what they are actually experiencing. That distance, in Joan's case, would become the defining feature of her life. Not immediately, not in a way that could be captured in a single moment, but gradually, and then all at once. Because the story of Joan Bennett Kennedy is not simply the story of a difficult marriage, or a public struggle, or a woman who lost her footing in a world that demanded more than she could give. It is something more specific than that. It is the story of what happens when a person is placed inside a system that does not have the language or the permission to recognize who they actually are, and what that system requires in return. The photograph does not show any of this. It cannot. What it shows instead is the surface, the version of events that everyone agreed to see. But if you stay with it long enough, if you allow yourself to look just slightly beyond what it presents, it begins to reveal something else. Not the full story, but the first sign that there is one. She was there. She was always there. But she was never really seen. Before she became part of a family that would define an era. Before her identity was reshaped by proximity to power, Joan Bennett Kennedy existed in a world that appeared, on the surface, stable and well-ordered. She was born in 1936 and raised in Bronxville, New York, a place that did not demand explanation, a place where expectations were clear and where lives followed patterns that rarely needed to be questioned. It was the kind of environment that produced composure. Her family belonged to a version of America that valued structure, discipline, presentation, restraint. Her father was successful, her mother attentive. The household organized around the idea that things should be handled properly, not dramatically, not publicly, properly. Emotions, when they appeared, were not something to be explored. They were something to be managed. This distinction matters because it shaped the way she learned to exist. She was not raised to confront feeling. She was raised to contain it. From the outside, she fit easily into that world. She was intelligent, soft-spoken, attentive in the way that people often describe as natural, though it is usually learned. There was nothing disruptive about her presence, nothing that demanded attention. She moved through her early life in a way that suggested alignment between who she was and what was expected of her. But alignment is not the same as understanding. And the absence of conflict does not mean the presence of strength. She found her identity early on in music. The piano gave her something the rest of her environment did not. It allowed for expression without exposure, emotion without confrontation. She could feel deeply without needing to explain what those feelings were. In a household where articulation of emotion was limited, music provided a language that did not require translation. It became, quietly, central. Not as ambition, but as refuge. At Manhattanville College, that version of her continued to develop. The institution itself reflected the same values she had grown up with: Catholic, structured, built around discipline and presentation. Women were expected to be composed, capable, prepared for a future that emphasized grace over assertion. And she fit. Not because she questioned it, but because she did not. She was well-liked, attractive in a way that did not feel excessive, approachable, the kind of person people described as kind, as gentle, as easy to be around. She did not challenge the environment she was in. She moved within it comfortably, fulfilling its expectations without resistance. But there is a cost to that kind of ease. When a person is shaped primarily by what is expected of them, they do not always develop the ability to define themselves independently of those expectations. They become fluent in response, but not in direction. They understand how to be chosen. They do not always understand how to choose. This distinction would become important later. At the time, it did not feel like a limitation. It felt like life working the way it was supposed to. She had everything that suggested a future that would be stable, respectable, admired. There was no indication from the outside that anything would deviate from that path. No visible fracture. No sign that the structure she had grown up in might not be sufficient for what would come next. And then she met him. Not in a dramatic setting, not in a way that would later be remembered as inevitable. It happened through connection, through proximity, through Jean Kennedy Smith, who introduced her to her brother, Ted Kennedy. At first, it looked like something familiar. He was charming, confident, already moving within a world that felt larger than the one she had known. There was a sense of direction in him, a clarity that did not require explanation. Where she had been shaped by expectation, he seemed to move through expectation as something he controlled. It is often in that contrast that recognition is mistaken for connection. He saw her, or at least he saw something that fit. And she, in turn, stepped towards something that felt like expansion, a life that extended beyond the boundaries she had always known, into a space that promised significance, movement, purpose. It did not feel like a risk. It felt like continuation, a natural progression from one structured world into another, larger one. But what she could not yet see was that the system she had grown up in, controlled, restrained, emotionally limited, had prepared her for something very specific. Not for independence, not for resistance, but for adaptation. And the world she was about to enter would require exactly that, only more of it than she had ever been asked to give. Because when she stepped into the Kennedy family, she would not just be entering a marriage, she would be entering a structure that did not bend. And that did not make space for the kind of person she actually was. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not become perfect by accident. It was not a quality she discovered. It was something she learned slowly, quietly, through repetition. By the time she reached her early 20s, she understood how to move through a room without disturbing it, how to respond in ways that made others comfortable, how to present herself in a way that aligned with what was expected rather than what was felt. At Manhattanville College, that ability became more refined. The institution was not designed to produce disruption. It was designed to produce women who could function within a particular version of society, composed, gracious, capable of navigating environments where appearance mattered as much as substance. It emphasized discipline, restraint, a kind of quiet confidence that did not challenge authority but moved alongside it. Joan did not struggle within that system. She adapted to it almost seamlessly. She was known as kind, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, who did not impose herself on a space, but made that space easier for others to exist in. There is a quality to people like that is often misunderstood. It is described as natural, as though it emerges without effort. But more often, it is the result of attention, of learning how to read a room, how to anticipate what is needed, how to become what is expected before it is explicitly asked. She did this well. She was admired, but not in a way that created distance. She was attractive, but not in a way that demanded attention. She existed within a narrow balance, visible, but not overwhelming, present, but not dominant. It made her easy to choose. And that, in many ways, was the role she had been prepared for. To be chosen, not to question why, not to define the terms, but to be the person who fit. This is where the distinction begins to matter. Because when a person builds their identity around being accepted, around aligning with what others expect, they often do not develop the ability to step outside of that alignment. They become fluent in being what is needed, but not in knowing what they need. For Joan, this did not feel like a limitation. It felt like success. Her life, at that point, appeared to be unfolding exactly as it should. She had the qualities that were valued. She moved through environments that reinforced those qualities. There was no visible friction between who she was and what was expected of her. And then she entered a space where those expectations intensified. She met Ted Kennedy through his sister, Jean Kennedy Smith. The introduction itself was unremarkable, social, casual, the kind of moment that would not have stood out if not for what followed. But from the beginning, the dynamic was clear. Ted did not need to adjust himself to the room. The room adjusted to him. He carried with him a sense of direction that did not need to be explained, a confidence that had been reinforced by environment, by expectation, by the knowledge that his life would unfold within a structure already built for him. He was not searching for a place. He was already in it. For someone like Joan, that presence held a particular kind of gravity. It did not feel overwhelming. It felt definitive. There is a difference between being drawn to a person and being drawn to what they represent. In Ted, she saw not only a man, but a life that appeared larger, more significant, more certain than the one she had known. It offered something she had not yet developed on her own, a sense of direction. And in her, he saw something equally clear. She fit. She fit the image, the expectation, the role that existed within the structure he was already part of. She was composed, elegant, non-disruptive. She did not challenge. She did not complicate. She aligned. And alignment, in that context, was not incidental. It was essential. Their relationship moved forward quickly, not because it was deeply examined, but because it did not need to be. From the outside, it made sense. It fit within a narrative that was already understood. A Kennedy marriage was not just a personal decision. It was a continuation of something larger, of image, of legacy, of expectation. Joan stepped into that movement without resistance. Because she had never been taught to resist. She had been taught to adapt. And at that moment, adaptation felt like the same thing as belonging. It felt like being chosen. But being chosen is not the same as being understood. And stepping into a role is not the same as being prepared for what that role requires. She would not realize that immediately, because from the outside, everything still looked exactly as it should. She was the perfect girl. And that was precisely the problem. Joan Bennett Kennedy married Ted Kennedy in 1958, and in doing so, she did not simply enter a marriage. She entered a structure that had been built long before she arrived, one that did not need her to define it, only to fit within it. From the outside, it appeared seamless. The ceremony, the photographs, the public reception of it all, everything aligned with what people expected from a Kennedy wedding. It reinforced an image that had already taken shape: youth, elegance, continuity. Another chapter in a story that seemed, at the time, inevitable. But what she stepped into was not a family in the ordinary sense. It was something closer to a system. At its center was Joseph Kennedy Sr., whose influence extended far beyond his direct presence. He had built the family not only as a private unit, but as a project, one defined by ambition, by discipline, by a clear understanding that image and power were inseparable. The success of the family was not incidental. It was constructed, managed, maintained. And within that structure, each person had a role. The men were expected to lead, to achieve, to extend the reach of the name into politics, into influence, into history itself. Their failures, when they occurred, were contained. Their successes were amplified. The women were expected to support, not passively, but precisely. They were to be composed, presentable, unwavering. They were to reinforce the image without disrupting it, to absorb tension without reflecting it outward. Their role was not to redefine the structure, but to stabilize it. Joan fit that role, not because she had chosen it with full awareness, but because she had been shaped in a way that made that role feel natural. She understood composure. She understood restraint. She understood how to present herself in a way that aligned with expectation. What she had not been prepared for was the scale of what that expectation required, because this was not a private environment. It was public, constantly. Every appearance mattered. Every gesture could be interpreted. Every moment existed within a larger narrative that extended beyond the individuals themselves. There was no clear boundary between personal life and public image. They overlapped continuously until it became difficult to separate one from the other. For someone who had learned to manage emotion rather than express it, this might have seemed manageable at first. It was, in a sense, an extension of what she already knew. But the difference was intensity. In her childhood, composure had been a value. Here, it was a requirement. And the consequences of failing to maintain it were not confined to private discomfort. They carried public weight. She adapted, as she always had. She learned how to stand beside Ted in a way that complemented him without competing with him, how to move through events without drawing attention away from what mattered, how to exist within the frame without attempting to redefine it. She became, in every visible sense, exactly what the role required. And for a time, that was enough. Or at least, it appeared to be. Because systems like this are not designed to reveal their strain immediately. They function through consistency, through repetition, through the appearance that everything is holding together. The pressure they exert is often gradual, distributed across time rather than concentrated in a single moment. But pressure, even when it is subtle, accumulates. It builds in the space between what is expected and what is experienced. in the distance between the image that must be maintained and the reality that cannot always align with it. For Joan, that distance began to take shape slowly, not in a way that could be named, not in a way that could be addressed directly, but in small adjustments, in moments of tension that were absorbed rather than expressed, in the quiet realization that the role she had stepped into did not allow for the full range of who she was. She had not been asked to bring herself into the system. She had been asked to become part of it. And becoming part of something like that does not always feel like belonging. Sometimes it feels like reduction, like narrowing, like existing within a version of yourself that is easier to manage than the one you actually are. She did not resist this. Not at first, because resistance requires recognition. And recognition takes time. From the outside, nothing had changed. She was still composed, still present, still aligned with everything the role demanded. But internally, something had begun. A shift. Small, almost imperceptible. The first indication that what she had entered was not something she would be able to sustain indefinitely, because the system she had adapted to was not built to adapt to her. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not disappear all at once. There was no single moment where her identity gave way to the life she had entered. What happened instead was slower, more difficult to recognize, an accumulation of small adjustments that, over time, began to replace what had once been her own sense of self. From the outside, the marriage to Ted Kennedy appeared stable. They had children. They moved through public life in a way that reinforced the image expected of them. She stood beside him at events, composed, attentive, fulfilling the role she had been given with a consistency that made it seem effortless. The structure held, the narrative remained intact. But what was visible did not account for what was happening beneath it. Ted was unfaithful. Not occasionally, not in a way that could be dismissed as a singular mistake, but repeatedly. And within the world they inhabited, this was not treated as something extraordinary. It was, in many ways, normalized, absorbed into a broader pattern that did not require confrontation as long as it did not disrupt the surface. This is where the structure revealed itself most clearly. Because the issue was not simply the infidelity. It was the expectation that it would be endured, silently, without escalation, without visible reaction. Joan knew. There was no ambiguity in that. The signs were present. The patterns were consistent. The absence of denial made the reality impossible to ignore. But knowing something is not the same as being allowed to respond to it. And within the system she had entered, response, particularly emotional response, was not part of her role. She was not there to challenge. She was there to maintain. And so she did what she had been prepared to do. She adapted. At first, this did not feel like erasure. It felt like endurance. A continuation of the same discipline she had learned earlier in life, managing feeling rather than expressing it, maintaining composure rather than disrupting it. She absorbed what was happening, contained it, prevented it from altering the outward structure of her life. But endurance has a cost, and when that cost is paid repeatedly, without interruption, it begins to change the person who is paying it. She became more careful, more contained. The parts of her that did not align with what was required were not expressed. They were set aside, quietly, without acknowledgement. Over time, this process did not just hide those parts. It reduced them. Because what is not used, what is not expressed, what is consistently deferred, begins to disappear. This is how erasure happens. Not through force, but through repetition, through the gradual narrowing of what is allowed to exist. Within the marriage, Joan's role became increasingly defined by what she did not do. She did not confront. She did not expose. She did not destabilize. Her presence functioned as a form of continuity, a signal that everything was still in place, still functioning, still aligned with expectation. And that signal mattered. Not just privately, but publicly. Because Ted's career continued to expand, his position required stability, credibility, the appearance of a life that was intact. And Joan, by maintaining that appearance, became part of the mechanism that allowed everything else to continue. She was not simply a participant in the marriage. She was part of its management. And in being part of that management, she moved further away from herself. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes from this position. It is not the isolation of being alone. It is the isolation of being present in a life that does not fully include you, of performing a role that others recognize, while the person performing it becomes less visible, even to herself. She was surrounded by people, by family, by public attention, by the constant movement of a life that appeared full. But none of that created space for what she was experiencing, because there was no structure within that world that allowed for it. No language, no permission. And so the process continued, quietly, consistently, without interruption, until what had once been adaptation became something else, something more permanent. She was still there, still visible, still fulfilling everything that was expected of her. But the distance between that version of her and the person she had once been was growing. And there was no mechanism within the life she was living that could close that distance. Because the system did not recognize it as a problem, it recognized it as success. And that is what made it so difficult to see. From the outside, nothing had gone wrong. Everything was working exactly as it was supposed to, which meant that what was happening to her had no place to exist, except inside her. And inside her alone, Joan Bennett Kennedy did not enter trauma as a single event. It did not arrive in a form that could be contained, named, and processed before the next thing occurred. What defined those years was not one loss, but a sequence of them close enough together that there was no clear space between impact and continuation. The structure she had entered did not pause. It did not slow down to allow for grief. It absorbed it, and then moved forward. In November of 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The moment was not private. It unfolded in full view of the country, transforming personal loss into something collective, something that belonged to the public as much as to the family itself. The shock was immediate. The scale of it impossible to comprehend fully in real time. For Joan, the experience was indirect, but not distant. She was inside the family, inside the system that now had to reorganize itself around absence. What had once been forward movement, ambition, expansion, the steady progression of a name into history, was interrupted, and in that interruption, something changed. Not visibly at first, but structurally. The pressure increased. The expectations did not lessen. They intensified, because loss, in that environment, was not something that allowed for withdrawal. It required continuation. There were appearances to maintain, roles to fulfill. The image had to remain intact, even as the foundation beneath it shifted. And then, 5 years later, it happened again. In June of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. Another public loss. Another moment that transformed private grief into something shared, something that required composure in the presence of shock. By then, the pattern had begun to take shape. Tragedy, public response, continuation. There was no space between these phases, no period where the experience could be processed without interruption. And within that pattern, Joan remained in the same position she had always occupied. Present, composed, unquestioning. She did what was expected, because she had been prepared to do exactly that. But preparation for composure is not preparation for accumulation. Grief that is not expressed does not disappear. It settles. It remains. and over time, it changes the way a person experiences everything else. Around this same period, her own life carried losses that were not public, but no less significant. She experienced miscarriages, events that, within the structure she inhabited, did not take on the same visibility as the tragedies that defined the family's public narrative. They were private, contained, absorbed. There is a particular kind of grief attached to loss that is not acknowledged. It does not receive the same language, the same recognition. It exists, but without the structure that allows it to be shared. For Joan, these experiences added another layer to what was already building. Loss within the family, loss within herself, and no clear space for either. Then, in 1964, Ted Kennedy was involved in a plane crash that nearly killed him. The event introduced a different kind of instability, not loss, but the possibility of it, sudden and immediate. Survival did not resolve that tension. It extended it. It introduced the awareness that everything could change without warning. By this point, the pattern was no longer intermittent. It was continuous. Each event added to the last, not replacing it, not allowing it to be completed, but layering over it. The system continued to function, to produce the same outward image of stability, of continuity, of control. But internally, the accumulation was altering something. For Joan, the effect was not dramatic. It did not present as visible collapse. It presented as strain, a quiet, persistent pressure that did not release. She continued to appear as she always had composed, attentive, aligned with expectation. There was no outward indication that anything had shifted beyond what was already known. That was the nature of the role she occupied. It required consistency, regardless of what was occurring beneath it. But consistency, under pressure, becomes something else. It becomes effort. And effort, when sustained over time without relief, begins to fail. There was no space for her to break. Not publicly, not within the structure she inhabited. And so the breaking, when it began, did not look like breaking. It looked like adaptation, like small changes in behavior, like ways of managing what could not be expressed. This is where the distinction becomes critical. Because trauma is not defined only by what happens, it is defined by what is allowed to happen afterward. In Joan's case, nothing was allowed. No interruption. No withdrawal. No visible disruption of the role she had been given. And so the trauma did what it often does in the absence of expression. It moved inward. It settled into the way she experienced the world, the way she processed emotion, the way she responded to pressure that no longer had a clear origin because it had become continuous. She was not failing. She was adapting to something that did not allow for any other response. But adaptation, when it is sustained under those conditions, has limits. And those limits do not appear suddenly. They emerge slowly, in ways that are easy to overlook until they are no longer possible to ignore. By the end of that period, nothing outward had collapsed. The structure still held. The image remained intact. She was still present, still composed, still fulfilling everything that was expected of her. But internally, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The accumulation had reached a point where it could no longer be contained in the same way. And the next phase of her life would not be defined by what happened to her, but by how she began to cope with it. Because there had never been space to process what she had lived through, only space to carry it. And eventually, carrying it would no longer be enough. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not cause what happened at Chappaquiddick. She was not in the car. She was not on the bridge. She was not there the night everything changed. And yet, from that moment on, she would carry it. On the 18th of July, 1969, Ted Kennedy drove off a narrow wooden bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. In the car with him was a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne. She did not survive. The facts, as they were presented, unfolded in fragments. The car submerged, the escape, the delay. Hours passed before the incident was reported. By the time it reached the public, it was no longer just an accident. It was a scandal, and not the kind that could be contained quietly. It reached beyond politics, beyond private life. It raised questions that did not have simple answers about responsibility, about truth, about what had happened in the space between the crash and the moment it was acknowledged. The country watched, and the Kennedy name, which had been shaped by ambition and tragedy, now carried something else: suspicion. Joan was not part of the event, but she was part of the structure that had to absorb it. At the time, she was pregnant. That detail is often mentioned briefly, as though it exists on the edge of the story. But it matters, because it places her not only outside the event, but in a state of vulnerability that had no space to be acknowledged once the scandal took hold. The system moved quickly. There were statements to prepare, appearances to manage, a narrative to construct that would allow Ted to remain within the structure he occupied. The focus shifted immediately to containment, not of what had happened, but of how it would be seen. And within that process, Joan's role was already defined. She would stand beside him. She would not contradict. She would not destabilize. She would be present in a way that suggested continuity, that reassured, that allowed the image to hold. This is what she did. There are images from that period, public appearances, statements, moments where she is positioned next to him, composed, silent, aligned. From the outside, it looks like support, like loyalty, like the continuation of a marriage under pressure. But what those images do not show is the absence of choice. Because support, in that context, was not something she could offer or withhold. It was required. She had no role in what had happened, but she had a role in what happened next. And that distinction is what defines the moment. The public response was divided. Some defended him, others did not. The questions remained. The uncertainty did not resolve. And through all of it, Joan remained in place, visible, but not heard. This is where the structure reveals its most exacting demand. It does not ask whether a person is responsible. It asks whether they can maintain the appearance of stability in the absence of clarity. Joan did, because she had been prepared to do exactly that. But the cost of doing so did not remain external. Shortly after the incident, she miscarried. The timing is not incidental. It is not something that can be separated cleanly from what preceded it, even if it is not defined by a single cause. It exists within the same sequence, within the same accumulation of pressure, of stress, of emotional strain that had already been building for years. And once again, the loss was not something that could be fully acknowledged. Not publicly, not within the narrative that had already taken shape around the scandal. It was absorbed, contained, added to everything that had come before it. This is what makes Chappaquiddick a turning point. Not because it was the first fracture, but because it was the moment where the fractures became impossible to separate. Public scandal, private loss, structural expectation, all occurring at the same time, without space between them. For Joan, this was not just another event to endure. It was the moment where endurance itself began to fail. Because until that point, she had been able to maintain the role, to adapt, to absorb, to continue without visible disruption. The system had held, and she had held within it. But this introduced something different. A level of exposure that could not be managed in the same way. A level of pressure that did not dissipate. And a loss that did not have a place to exist. She remained. She continued to stand beside him. The image did not break. From the outside, everything still appeared intact. But internally, something had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but definitively. The distance between the role she was performing and the reality she was living had become too large to ignore. and there was still no space within the structure to address it. No language, no permission, only continuation. And continuation, at that point, required something new. Not just endurance, but escape, because what she had been carrying could no longer be contained in the same way. And when something can no longer be contained, it does not disappear. It finds another way out. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not begin drinking as an act of rebellion. There was no moment where she decided to step outside the structure she had spent years sustaining. What happened was quieter than that. It emerged not as a choice, but as a response. By the time she reached the 1970s, the accumulation had already taken hold. Years of controlled emotion, years of public composure, years of absorbing what could not be expressed. None of it had disappeared. It had simply been deferred. And what is deferred does not resolve. It waits. Alcohol offered something immediate. Not clarity. Not resolution. But interruption. A pause in the constant management of feeling. A way to quiet what had never been allowed to surface fully. It did not require explanation. It did not require permission. It altered experience quickly, without the need to confront what had created the need for it in the first place. At first, it did not appear significant. Social drinking, occasional, contained within the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. It existed alongside everything else, not yet replacing it. From the outside, nothing had changed. She still appeared as she always had, composed, present, aligned with expectation. But the role she occupied had not become easier. It had become heavier. The distance between what she felt and what she was required to present had widened, and maintaining that distance required increasing effort. Alcohol reduced that effort. It softened the tension. It allowed her, briefly, to exist without the constant need to regulate herself. That relief, even when temporary, is powerful. And over time, it became necessary. This is how the shift happens. Not through a single decision, but through repetition. What begins as occasional becomes consistent. What is used to manage becomes something that must be managed itself. The boundary between control and reliance does not disappear suddenly. It erodes. For Joan, that erosion was gradual, but irreversible. By the mid-1970s, the pattern had established itself. Drinking was no longer incidental. It was integrated into the way she moved through her life. It existed in the background, then moved forward, becoming more visible, more difficult to contain. And still, the structure around her did not change. The expectations remained. The appearances continued. She was still required to function within the same role, even as her ability to sustain it was beginning to falter. This is where the contradiction becomes most visible. From the outside, what emerged was framed as failure. A woman who drank too much. A public figure who could not maintain composure. A deviation from the image that had been established. But that framing does not account for what created the behavior. It isolates the symptom and ignores the system. Joan was not stepping outside the structure. She was responding to it, to years of pressure without release, to loss without processing, to a role that required presence without authenticity. Alcohol did not create those conditions. It made them temporarily bearable. By the late 1970s, the consequences became harder to manage. There were public incidents, appearances where the strain showed, moments where the composure that had defined her for so long could no longer be maintained in the same way. The response, once again, was not to examine the conditions. It was to manage the outcome. Rehabilitation, intervention, attempts to restore the version of her that had previously functioned within the system. She entered treatment, left, returned. The pattern repeated. Recovery, relapse, recovery, relapse. Each cycle approached as a discrete event, something to be corrected, rather than as part of a larger process that had never been addressed at its origin. And within each cycle, the same expectation remained: that she would return to form, that she would resume the role, that she would restore the image. But the image was no longer sustainable because the conditions that had shaped her behavior had not changed. They had only intensified. Her marriage to Ted Kennedy had not resolved. The distance between them had become more pronounced. The infidelity continued. The emotional separation, once subtle, was now clear. She remained within it, but no longer in the same way. The alignment that had once defined her role had fractured. And without that alignment, the structure she had adapted to began to feel less like belonging and more like confinement. This is where collapse begins. Not as a single event, but as the point where adaptation no longer works, where the strategies that once allowed a person to function within a system become insufficient for sustaining that function. For Joan, alcohol had been one of those strategies. And when it ceased to be enough, what remained was everything it had been holding back. The accumulation, the loss, the pressure, unresolved, uncontained, still present. From the outside, it looked like decline, like instability, like a person losing control. But that interpretation depends on where you begin the story. If you begin with the drinking, it appears as failure. If you begin with what preceded it, it appears as something else, as the inevitable outcome of a life lived within conditions that did not allow for release. She was not failing in isolation. She was breaking under weight that had been accumulating for years, weight that had never been allowed to be set down. And by the end of that period, the distinction between the role she had been performing and the person she actually was could no longer be maintained. The system still held. The image still existed, but she no longer fit inside it in the same way. And for the first time, that misalignment could be seen. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not collapse in private. That is what made this phase different from everything that came before it. For years, what she carried had been contained, managed within the boundaries of a role that required composure above all else. But by the late 1970s, containment was no longer possible. What had been internal became visible. And once it became visible, it could no longer be controlled in the same way. The shift did not happen suddenly. It unfolded in moments, appearances where something felt slightly off, interviews where her responses did not align with what was expected, events where the precision that had once defined her presence gave way to something less predictable. At first, these moments were interpreted as anomalies. Then they became a pattern. By the time Ted Kennedy began his 1980 presidential campaign, the pattern was no longer possible to ignore. The campaign required visibility. It required Joan to appear publicly, repeatedly, in a role that had always demanded consistency. But consistency was no longer something she could produce reliably. She appeared anyway. There are images from that period that reflect the tension clearly. Joan, standing beside Ted, attempting to maintain the structure that had defined her life, while something within that structure was already breaking. Her movements were less controlled, her presence less contained. The effort required to perform the role had become visible in a way it never had before. And visibility changes everything. Because once something can be seen, it can be interpreted. And once it is interpreted, it becomes subject to judgment. The media responded quickly. The narrative shifted. What had once been private strain became public identity. She was no longer simply the composed wife within the Kennedy structure. She became something else, something easier to define, easier to categorize. Unstable, problematic, a liability. These labels did not emerge from nowhere, but they did not account for context. They isolated behavior from cause. They framed what was happening as deviation, rather than as the result of sustained pressure that had never been addressed. This is how public unraveling functions. It simplifies. It reduces complexity to something that can be easily understood, easily repeated, easily consumed. For Joan, This reduction was immediate. Her struggles with alcohol, which had developed over years, were now visible in a way that allowed them to be defined without nuance. The cycles of treatment and relapse, the attempts to regain control, the ongoing effort to function within a system that had never adjusted to her needs, none of this translated into the narrative that was constructed around her. What translated was failure. Public, visible, undeniable. And once that narrative takes hold, it is difficult to disrupt. She entered rehabilitation again. Left. Returned. Each attempt framed as a step toward recovery, but also as confirmation of instability. The repetition did not generate understanding. It reinforced perception. At the same time, her marriage was reaching its limit. The distance between her and Ted, which had existed for years, was no longer something that could be contained within the structure of the relationship. It had become visible, undeniable, impossible to reconcile within the same framework that had once held everything together. In 1982, they divorced. 20 years. 2 decades of adaptation, endurance, alignment with a role that had defined her adult life, and now she was outside of it. From the outside, this could be interpreted as release, as freedom, as the removal of the structure that had contributed to everything that had followed. But removal is not the same as resolution. Because when a person has spent years defining themselves within a system, stepping outside of it does not immediately restore a sense of identity. It creates absence. For Joan, that absence was disorienting. She was no longer required to maintain the same role, no longer positioned within the same structure. But she had not developed a version of herself that existed independently of it. The system had shaped her. And now, without it, there was no clear framework to replace what had been removed. At the same time, the public perception did not shift. She was still defined by what had become visible, by the unraveling, by the failure. There is a particular kind of difficulty in attempting to rebuild when the narrative surrounding you has already been fixed. Every action is interpreted through that lens. Every attempt to change is measured against a version of you that has been simplified into something static. She continued to try, to recover, to reestablish control over her life, but the process was no longer private. It existed within the same public space that had contributed to the collapse. And within that space, success does not always register, but failure does. By the early 1980s, the transition was complete. She was no longer the composed figure within the Kennedy image. She was no longer the person who stabilized the structure. She had become something else. A visible example of what happens when that structure breaks. But even that description is incomplete. Because what the public saw as unraveling was, in many ways, the first honest reflection of what had been happening for years. Not a departure from reality, but an exposure of it. The role had collapsed. The image had fractured. And what remained was the person who had always existed beneath it. Uncontained, unresolved, and, for the first time, fully visible. Joan Bennett Kennedy did not disappear after the divorce. That is not how her story ends. But what followed was not a clean beginning either. There was no clear moment where the past was set aside and replaced with something stable, something resolved. What remained instead was a life that had to be rebuilt, without the structure that had once defined it, and without the version of herself that structure had required. For the first time in more than 2 decades, she existed outside of the Kennedy system, no longer positioned beside Ted Kennedy, no longer required to maintain the image that had shaped her adult life, no longer held within the expectations that had dictated how she moved, spoke, and responded. From the outside, this could be understood as freedom. But freedom, when it arrives without preparation, does not always feel like release. It can feel like absence. Because the system had not only constrained her, it had defined her. And without it, there was no immediate replacement for that definition. She had to learn, slowly, what it meant to exist as herself, separate from the role she had occupied for so long. That process did not unfold in a straight line. It did not move steadily toward clarity. It was uneven, interrupted, shaped by the same patterns that had developed during the years before. She continued to struggle with alcohol. The cycles did not end with the divorce. They shifted. Recovery remained an ongoing process, entered, left, entered again. Each attempt represented effort. Each relapse reflected the persistence of something that had never been fully resolved. The conditions that had contributed to her dependence had not disappeared simply because the structure around her had changed. They had been internalized, and internal conditions do not respond to external change in simple ways. She wrote, she published The Joy of Classical Music, a work that returned, in some sense, to the part of herself that had existed before everything else. Music had always been a place where she could express without being exposed, where feeling could exist without needing to be translated into language. Writing about it allowed her to reconnect with that space, not as escape, but as continuity. She studied, returned to education later in life, completing degrees that had once been deferred. This, too, was part of the process, not of reinvention, but of reconstruction, building something that had not been fully formed before. She spoke publicly about addiction, not in the language of spectacle, but in the language of experience. She acknowledged what had happened, not as a single failure, but as part of a longer trajectory that had begun long before it became visible. In doing so, she shifted her position from someone defined by her struggle to someone who could articulate it. But articulation does not erase experience. It does not remove what remains. And what remained, for Joan, was not only the addiction. It was the accumulation, the years of adaptation, the losses that had never been fully processed, the identity that had been shaped by a system and then removed from it. These things do not disappear. They change form. In the years that followed, her life continued in a way that did not fit easily into a single narrative. There were periods of stability, of clarity, of movement towards something that felt more aligned with who she was. And there were interruptions, returns to patterns that had not fully resolved, public moments that reinforced the perception that had already been established. The world did not revise its understanding of her. It rarely does. Once a narrative is fixed, it tends to remain. She was still, in many accounts, defined by what had gone wrong. The drinking, the unraveling, the failure to maintain the role she had once fulfilled. But that version of her does not account for what continued. Because she did continue. She remained present in the lives of her children. She maintained relationships. She worked, wrote, spoke, attempted repeatedly to build something that existed outside of the framework that had once defined her. And that effort, even when interrupted, even when incomplete, matters. It complicates the narrative. It resists the simplicity that public stories often require. Later in life, loss returned in a different form. Her daughter, Kara, died in 2011 after a heart attack. It was not the first loss she had experienced, but it existed within a life already shaped by accumulation. Another layer, another absence that did not replace what had come before, but added to it. Then, in 2009, Ted Kennedy died. The man whose presence had defined so much of her life directly and indirectly was gone. Whatever remained of that connection, however it had changed over time, was no longer active. It became part of the past in a way that could not be revisited. And still, she remained. This is what defines the final phase of her life. Not resolution. Not redemption in the way it is often framed. But continuation. A life that did not simplify itself, that did not resolve into a clear conclusion, that remained, even at the end, shaped by contradiction. She had been part of one of the most visible families in American history. And yet, her own story had never been fully told within that visibility. She had been present in moments that defined a generation. And yet, her experience of those moments had remained largely unspoken. She had been seen, constantly. And still, she had spent much of her life existing in a way that was not fully recognized. What remained then is not a single version of her. Not the composed figure from the early photographs. Not the unraveling figure from the years that followed. But something more complex. A person who adapted, endured, broke, and continued. A person whose life cannot be reduced to the moments that were easiest to observe. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand her. Not as a symbol of failure, not as a cautionary example, but as someone who lived within conditions that did not allow for simplicity and who continued, despite that, to try to build something of her own. Not perfectly, not completely, but persistently. And in the end, that persistence is what remains. Not the image, not the narrative, but the life that existed beyond both. A life that never fit neatly into the story that was told about it, and never stopped moving, even when it no longer had a clear direction forward.